Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. So we are here to do two things. One is to celebrate the publication of the book Conflict and Collaboration for Better or Worse. And the second is to talk about future research questions. So just a minute about the genesis of the book. As someone said, gee, it was kind of like giving birth. Because the book started as a discussion among faculty who were reacting to the name of the research center, PARC. And notice this wonderful long name, Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration. It was formerly called Program for the Analysis and Resolution of Conflicts, PARC with one C. In 2009, we changed the name to PARCC to represent the fact that the field of conflict had been changing, to include more work on collaboration, and in particular, faculty had joined PARC from other parts of the Maxwell School, particularly public administration, who were doing work on collaboration. And so we felt that it was important to sort of represent the changing nature of the field. However, we realized that we weren't quite sure what it meant, whether these concepts were related to each other, or if so, how they were related. And so we started a working group of PARC associates, faculty associates, many of whom are in this room, to start talking about those concepts and what they mean and how they're related to each other. And that really is the genesis of the book. The conversation went on for quite a long time. It was very challenging because we realized we had, 6 disciplines in the room, all of whom had different definitions for the same words, different ways of looking at the world. But we did ultimately come up with this volume called Conflict and Collaboration for Better or Worse. So what we're going to do today, as you can see from the program, is very, very briefly, you will hear from most of the authors of the chapters. They will be giving you a sense of what is in the chapter and then implications. And we hope that as you're listening, you'll be thinking about the second goal of our symposium today, which is what are some ideas that we really need to move forward? What are some research questions? Again, what are things that are kind of popping for you that we ought to think about as future research efforts? So with that, I would like to turn it over to my co-editor and author of Chapter 1, Louis Kriesberg.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
In the interest of stimulating discussion, I'm trying to be very brief so that we have time actually to talk about it together. I think that working group was an example of collaboration and contention in varying degrees for varying episodes. But it was fun and exciting, and obviously we all really enjoyed the game of trying to figure out what do you mean by this, how they fit together, and we certainly thought it was a worthwhile enterprise, and we continued it for a few years with multiple drafts of chapters critiqued by each other. And it was clear that we soon reached consensus on the fundamental matter, that there is a good way of doing conflicts and a bad way of doing it. There are some bad collaboration and good collaboration. And we wrestled with that. It's uncomfortable at times about the words. In my own chapter, I use more general words like contention and coordination. But I had a revelation as a result of those meetings. And the revelation was that, I always knew that conflicts are not isolated. They exist in larger context. But as we discussed things and looked at some cases, it was clear that every relationship has some contention in it and some collaboration, interdependence. And these are just dimensions of a relationship. And there are other dimensions, like how well people feel about the relationship and how well they benefit or not from it. And so these things waxed and waned in the course of time. And many of the chapters really indicate how the coordination got better or worse, or the conflict intensified destructively and then changed. And over time, the shifts occurred, but there were always some aspect of them present. That was a revelation for me and a simplification, and some people found it useful, others not so. This is the want among scholars, and some of the chapters dealt with it, with that, others didn't. But I don't bear grudges.
But he refuses to use the word collaboration.
Well, no, it's a particular kind of coordination. Anyway, on to the future. I want to give you some examples of 4 what I call implications or applications that I think are possible or ought to be. First, working across disciplines, even between different schools in the university, we might develop and test effective ways of conveying empirically grounded knowledge about better ways to wage conflicts and conduct collaboration. That may include various audiences in our society. In the past, I've had help from skilled editors in writing blogs and op-eds, and I have been a subject of videos made by people who know how to make them. So I think all of us have been excited by the value of interdisciplinarity, and that's one possible application. Another is a group of us might cooperate in developing handbooks, videos, or manuals of best practices in doing conflicts and collaboration better. And this can be done for different kinds of actors. We often kind of fixated on one. I think in our present society, it's clear that there are diverse actors and diverse ways of reaching them and employing them. I think that would be of focusing our work. Third, we might form teams to do research on how various kinds of governmental and non-governmental programs and policies affect people's sense of grievance and gratification. I think we know that they do, and we seem to misunderstand that quite a bit. And a lot of that was a misunderstanding that resulted in the election of 2016. We're still trying to figure it out. Well, we should do some more research about that, and with an eye to what would help reduce grievance and improve gratification. Finally, we might form interdisciplinary teams to study the changing relative importance of contention and of collaboration in various kinds of relations. as destructive conflicts become transformed, collaborative processes may expand and make the emerging peace among them more enduring. In retrospect, I remember what was an early research project of mine. I was a Fulbright research scholar in Cologne, Germany in 1956-57. And I was researching, interviewing people and analyzing the European coal and steel community, the first step towards European Union, and its contribution to building peaceful relations between Germany and France after generations of hatred and wars. It was an interesting, and I realize now, well, that is part of what peace building is, and to think of that. David Mitrani, I don't know, how many know the name David Mitrani? Okay. He was a very influential author who wrote about, I might be old, I can refer to these references, nobody knows, there's functional expansion, and once you start something, it can expand. And the coal and steel community was such a thing. It involved Germans and French coal mine executives and miners in transnational connections and activities, and was fundamental to the reconciliation between Frenchmen and Germans. Okay, so I wanted to be very brief. I've succeeded. I'm a minute ahead.
You have a minute and a half.
Okay. All right. I turn over my time to my colleagues.
Okay, so, all right. So I'm going to spend a minute summarizing the chapter for those of you who didn't have a chance to look at it. Deb's going to get the slides up. And as you can see from the program, this is the view from public administration, and you're going to notice as you hear from the different authors that you're going to be hearing views from a variety of disciplines. Got it, Deb?
It won't go up to the close.
Those are great reviews.
Okay. Tom will get it up for us.
Close this.
There we go.
Perfect.
And I actually need a clicker. Is there a clicker somewhere?
No. You can just point at me and I'll click.
No. Okay, I'll stand
Or
up
you
then.
can stand up here.
All right. Sorry. Technical difficulties.
Yeah.
So this will change.
The arrows, he said.
Oh, here?
Yep.
No?
Well, now I think you got it back to the other spots.
Here?
Well, hang on, I got.
Yeah.
Well, there
Okay.
you go.
Got it. All right. So public administration, as many of you know, has a pretty well-developed field of study in collaboration. This is a kind of a hot topic, but it's been going on for a number of years, whether it's kind of networks, collaborative networks providing service delivery, whether it's citizen engagement in collaborative processes, problem-solving collaborations, et cetera. So in the field of public administration, there are lots of people doing research on collaboration. The work that I write about with my colleague Rosemary O'Leary is trying to look at individual actors. There's not been as much work looking at individual actors, and in this case, we're looking at individual government managers and leaders engaging in collaboration. And notice our definition of collaboration gets at this concept of wicked problems, that we're defining collaboration as people operating in multi-organizational arrangements to solve problems that cannot be solved by a single organization. And therefore, what we're really looking at are people who are interdependent, who share goals, and who are engaging in horizontal leadership. Because in these collaborations, often the people in the room are at the same leadership level. And finally, the thing that we wanted to look at for this chapter, following up with Lou's comments, is the relationship between conflict and collaboration. Is there a relationship, and what does that relationship look like? So what did we find? Again, no surprise, as you'll hear from many of the authors, conflict may or may not be the right thing to do. There are certain conditions under which conflict is more likely to be a good approach or a bad approach. But for some, and this is Robert and John's concern, for some in public administration, it's normative. So as we gathered quotes, open-ended questions, we got a lot of quotes, we would hear government managers say, it is the right thing to do. It is what our citizens expect us to do. In some cases of political appointees, they would tell us, this is what people will elect us to do. So there was, in fact, a kind of normative edge to it. And for some, the purpose of the collaboration was not just operational to get things done, but in fact, it was highly relational. Their expectation was that the people in the collaboration would develop deeper relationships. So that gets to the notion of collaboration and conflict. What role does conflict play? Does it hurt the relationship? Does it help the relationship? Because we have these relational aspirations going on. So what did we find? We found indeed that people told us that conflict and collaboration are connected, that it can be a positive force if the conflict is managed constructively. It can be used to probe, to get better information, to come up with better solutions. And in fact, we did get evidence that it can result in deeper relationships, as people were hoping. But, big but, in order to get those sorts of results, it requires a very intentional use of a variety of skills. Again, no big surprise here, and the sorts of skills you'd expect, interpersonal skills, group skills. The thing that perhaps was more surprising is that in addition to the skills, we were told it also requires a mindset, a set of attributes that are foreign to the typical view of the manager sitting in some sort of government bureaucracy. So people said, people have to be open-minded. They have to be honest. They have to be humble. They have to have respect for others. They have to let go of power. And we found this interesting, and as a result, we think that there are some interesting implications that we can think about for the future. One, again, I think concern perhaps, which some of our colleagues did worry about, is that I believe there is in fact a normative view of collaboration in the public administration literature and field, that it is viewed as something that's kind of inherently positive. And we should explore that. Maybe that's okay. Maybe from a values perspective, the notion of people working together to do things is okay, but it is normative, and the concern for that is that, as I say later on, the use of an analytic framework to determine whether or not collaboration is the right approach, I think, is underused. In fact, you can't even find them if you're going through the sort of training that public officials get. You don't see those analytic frameworks that say, when do we collaborate, when do we not collaborate? There is a real lack of coherence and availability in training of public managers. And that's a concern, because if in fact you only get the benefits of collaboration if people are highly skilled, the fact that no one can agree on what the skills are and that there's no coherent training available at all means this is clearly a problem. The mindset is an interesting sort of finding there. Most of these people are working in power-driven bureaucracies, and we're kind of espousing this mindset, which is sort of completely at odds with that. We did some interviews where we heard managers say, well, we're highly situational. When we're in our bureaucracies, we're pretty much what you'd expect, but when we leave our bureaucracies and we enter our collaborative spaces, we're actually different, and that's intentional. So I think that probably needs to be explored, not just for this realm, but for other realms. Is that what happens? Do people sort of change when they're engaging in collaborative ventures versus non-collaborative ventures? The current environment, Lou sort of alluded to it, but there's a lot of parallel play going on right now. And that's a little bit of a concern, because some of the data we collected, particularly at the federal level, indicated that the agency mandates for collaboration, the fact that it was in strategic plans, the fact that in some cases funding will only be given to collaborative networks, that those mandates were helping people be more collaborative. We're now in an era where I'm not seeing the word collaboration being espoused at the federal level right now. I will say no more. And I worry about that. So what happens? Does this become that people have to go underground in order to be collaborative? What happens to those structured networks that have been operating for years, that are receiving money from the federal government only if they're operating in a collaborative framework? So I think, we're at an interesting time now where things are continuing, but whether or not they'll continue, that's a concern. And then finally, it was quite clear during our venture, and certainly you're going to read it in the book, which you're all going to buy multiple copies of, by the way, is that public administration, I suppose like any other discipline, has not really integrated disciplinary perspectives into its thinking about conflict and collaboration that came through in many of the other chapters. So I do think that we need to think more seriously about the integration of notions of power, integration of notions of privilege, of emotion and the impact of emotion, and a variety of other things which some disciplines completely take for granted when they discuss conflict and collaboration. But the field of public administration tends to be very instrumental, and I think needs to really enrich its thinking and practice when it in this arena. Okay, to you.
To me? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can stand, can I?
You can do anything you want.
All right. Can you flash something then? I came into this project very late in the game because I sort of, in a moment of weakness, said yes to her. She asked me to give a talk, and when she heard me talk, she said, "Hey, that fits into our book. Would you put it in there?" Well, I did.
Thank you.
But when I discovered, since one of my colleagues is a former NASA administrator and knows something about the space station, he said, put this in, then push this in. And then I talked to him, and he said, take that out, take that out, take that out. So I dealt with conflict and collaboration.
Constructively.
I hope so. As long as you like the chapter, it worked out. That's the space station. Okay. The international, I'm in public administration, international affairs, and I'm also in political science, which means that I kind of am interested in administration and bureaucracy, but I'm also interested in politics. So this International Space Station is, as I guess some of you know, is the single biggest science and technology project outside of military and human history. It cost $1 billion just to build it, and it is costing $2 to $3 billion a year to maintain it. It is an incredible story, and it goes back to 1984. Reagan began it for reasons of conflict, because at that time we had the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was building a space station. So if the Soviet Union is building a space station, the United States has to build a space station. And that moved along with all kinds of conflict along the way. 1993, Clinton, end of the Cold War, rechristens the space station from Space Station Freedom, Reagan's name, to the International Space Station, bringing Russia aboard as a collaborator. So Russia goes from a rival to a collaborator in 1993. It is occupied for the first time by a Russian and an American. It's only partially built in the year 2000, which means that if you are a freshman at Syracuse University, every day of your life, space has been occupied by a Russian and American, which tells you something about history and how it's moving along. And it was finished under Obama in 2011. And Trump plans to privatize it in 2024. We will see. In any event, the story is what I wrote about, and it's an interesting and important story. You really have. There's no way a picture can tell you about this. It's a football field size. It's the size of a football field. It is 250 miles above Earth, and it's moving at 17,000 miles an hour. And 5 separate space agencies, 16 separate nations put it together, and it was only assembled for the first time in space. And it's extraordinary. It's considered one of the great engineering projects in human history. It is also a great political story and a great public administration management story. What I've done in the chapter, which you can read, is I tell the story. And it goes through various technological stages in a developmental process. And I stop the story when it's built in 2011. It had to overcome many obstacles along the way of everything you could imagine. Technical, bureaucratic, political. 2 shuttle disasters, as you may recall, that killed 14 people. And the project kept going. Now, so from the standpoint of success, one can make all kinds of arguments about what is success, because it clearly cost too much, and it took too long, and the science may not be what we wish it would be yet, but certainly from an engineering standpoint, it's extraordinary. From my standpoint, and the standpoint, and the reason she asked me to do this, is it's an incredible story of conflict and collaboration, because the U.S.-Russian dimension of it is exceptional and exceptionally interesting. So what I've done is I wrote the story, and because you told me I could only talk for so many minutes, I sort of drew some lessons learned. Now, one of the differences, one of the things that makes public administration a little different from political science is it tends to be a bit more applied, which means we're always being pushed by our sponsors, whoever they may be, to draw lessons learned, and so it comes naturally to me. So here are some lessons learned. I have 6. One, it took some exceptional administrative leadership. NASA was the leader. We've got all these nations, but there was a clear managing partner. 75% of the money came from NASA. So NASA was clearly in charge. And the individual actors, 5 minutes, the individual actors who ran NASA had to make decisions along the way. And there are 3 kinds of leadership that is demonstrated along the way. What I call entrepreneurial leadership, getting it started and then to shift to Russia. Maintenance leadership, keeping it going. And finally, crisis management, because you have those 2 disasters. Second, as you allude, dependence. We really did need the Russians. We still do. You may have seen in the newspapers, The Soyuz that exploded, and we had 2 astronauts bailing out. That's the only way you can get into space now, through the Soyuz, since we shut down the shuttle. But it was also a knowledge dependence. The Soviets really knew something. The Russians actually knew something, and we learned a lot from them. Compartmentalization. The ability to protect this project from the political world domestically and the international political world at the same time. Protect the project. What political scientists call 2-level games, where you build coalitions domestically and internationally at the same time, making one coalition help you build the second coalition, back and forth. 5, continuity among the top leaders. The man who ran NASA during this period was there for a record-setting almost 10 years, which means he served under Bush 1, Clinton, and the beginning of Bush 2. That's unusual in Washington. But the same applied to the Russian leader, and the same applied to the European leader. You've got America, Russia, Europe, Japan, Canada. Those are the nations that are involved in it. And finally, 6th, I think the fact that this is a science and technology project makes it maybe different from some social projects. There was an underlying belief on the part that was widespread in the community of space, the space community, that if you wanted to explore out there, go back to the moon or onto Mars, you had to have a space station. It was a means to an end. Everybody agreed on the end. And to do that, they had to agree on a means. And this became the means. So you had the underlying consensus on the part of the community, the technical community, and you had exceptional leadership at the top, and the 2 came together. Implications: if we were going to deal with some of the huge problems that face the world that have a high technical content, like climate change, we're going to have to develop projects that are big and that cross nations. And I think the biggest project from which we can draw lessons is this one. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Robert Demgenski, and first I'd like to thank you all involved with the book for the opportunity to contribute to it and the opportunity to contribute to this chapter.
Could you speak a little more louder into the microphone?
Does this work?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
I can't hear it from this side. And I'm also very grateful for this project to be so interdisciplinary. It is really fascinating to see how these concepts are being approached from such a variety of disciplinary approaches. I have to admit that when Dr. Elman first asked me to contribute to the chapter and I read the title, Conflict and Collaborations, International Relations Theory, my first thought was, well, what is collaboration? I had to look it up. I had some sense of it and came across it some undergraduate work, but in my graduate coursework in international relations here at Syracuse University, I did not come across the concept. And I think there's a reason for that. And the term may have gained more traction in public administration and other fields as well. But that is less so the case in the international relations literature. And I think that our chapter demonstrates that to a certain extent. What we try to do is, even though we go through the classic 3 paradigms of realism, liberalism, or neoliberalism, and constructivism, we didn't make a point of reviving the old debate between the paradigms. What we wanted to do is to take a look at these concepts through these different schools of thoughts and see how they view conflict and collaboration, or cooperation as usually the term is used. So, I mean, I'm not going to bore you all with an explanation of realism, liberalism, constructivism, but for realists, states being an international system that is characterized by anarchy, the absence of a central governing authority, creates a system where mistrust is prevalent. It's a self-help system. The intentions of other actors in the system are uncertain, and if we believe that we know them now, we cannot rely on the intentions staying the same in the future. So cooperation is a fleeting phenomenon from the realist perspective. And it can be dangerous, especially if it's taken on the long term, in the core, in a nutshell. From the liberal and the liberal institutionalist perspective, there's something to be done about that, right, through institutions. And institutions through regulating norms of behavior, providing information, transparency, and reducing the fear of being cheated upon, can provide conditions that are more conducive to cooperative behavior. And constructive emphasize elements that are often overlooked by the other two schools of thought, such as the importance of values, identities, belief systems, etc. But through those three approaches, collaboration doesn't really come up. If we understand collaboration as something that is elevated beyond just cooperation, simple cooperation, right? And that is because cooperation itself is just so incredibly difficult, and if you talk about interstate relations, and especially the classical issues of war and peace, as just coordinating policies difficult to begin with, and just when simply the coexistence, right, is being challenged, it is difficult to even start talking about collaboration. Now, we ended this chapter on a positive, more optimistic note with a quote from Robert Jervis, right, saying that the world does seem to have changed and that we seem to have learned from the carnage of previous great wars. And I think this is true to a certain extent, but if we look through those three lenses in the contemporary international system, there's something that these schools of thought tell us, right? And so through the realist lens, we're in an increasingly multipolar environment with state actors in the Middle East, in Eurasia, and Northeast Asia that are not satisfied with the status quo. And according to that tradition, this distribution of power is especially dangerous. And perhaps it's one in which cooperation is all the most important, but also all the most difficult. And from a liberal institutionalist perspective, we see slow, perhaps signs of erosion in international institutions. If it's from NATO, the European Union, even the World Trade Organization and agencies of the UN, which is worrisome. And from a constructive perspective, if we look at the level of discourse also on the international stage, it is getting a little bit more extreme provocative, and coupled with a belief system in which war is considered as a thing of the past, passé a little bit, that we don't see it much as a threat in the future. And that is a belief that is held also in some military circles, right? That interstate war is not likely in the future. Coupled with that, it creates a dangerous combination, I believe, that is grounds for concern. And if that's not enough, if you look at the individual level of analysis, which we did not incorporate in this chapter here, we also see a more developed culture of personality across some states, which tends to confound, right, the personal interest of the leaders with the interest of the state, and that is also not conducive to cooperative efforts. And I'm sounding very pessimistic now about all of this. I don't mean to, but and there are some positive signs, right? I mean, let's try to bring something that is going on right now, and Putin and Trump, for example, are going to meet in the next few weeks, either to commemorate the armistice of World War I in Paris in a few weeks, or the end of next month, the G20 meeting in Buenos Aires. Just to say that history is not completely forgotten, of course, and that there is very well still institutional platforms for cooperation there. That's it. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions, comments about these 4 chapters.
This is a question for Director Gerard and Professor Lambright about the space station. It seems that from the public administration point of view, collaboration really has to be a top-down process. That's what it sounded like. But for the current administration, at the very top, there's no interest in collaboration at all. So what's your take on that?
I think there's different kinds of collaborations. So for the sort of collaboration that Harry's talking about, and I'll let you speak to that, it may require that top-down leadership, in which case that's what I'm kind of worried about in this environment, whether or not you're going to see leaders engage in that sort of collaboration. Now, maybe it will just be renamed. Maybe collaboration will just be public-private partnership all the time. You know, people are kind of clever about doing these things. But I do think that's potentially a concern. However, there's lots of other sorts of collaborations that go on that are not as highly visible and that do not necessarily require the kind of top leadership that something like a space station would take. And furthermore, for me, the really optimistic piece is twofold. One is that some of the structured collaborations are kind of set in law, regulation, budgetary stuff. I don't think they're going to go away. And some of the strongest collaborations we found were actually from the local government managers, who were all sorts of political parties, who are collaborating really because of need, as well as some normative. We heard a lot of normative stuff from them. And I don't think the need's going to go away. So while the changing political environment could change the language in the federal level, and maybe, I don't know, Harry can speak to what he thinks about endangering big projects, but I do think that the sorts of collaborations we're seeing will continue.
There is clearly a problem in Washington with Trump. He's, as you know, he talks a big game about space and wishes to build a whole new branch of the armed services called a Space Force. So a lot of rhetoric. The vice president seems to be a space buff. He's actually interested in it. The man in charge of NASA is was approved by one vote. Historically, NASA is a bipartisan agency. Historically, space is iconic in America. There's a movie called First Man that's out right now, and before that there was The Martian and a few others. What I see going on right now is leadership coming from an odd source, coming from Congress. There is a bipartisan group in Congress built around committees that foresaw problems with Trump and passed legislation that was called the Space Continuity Act of 2018. They foresaw problems and they tried to head them off by spelling out what had to be done as we went through this transition. So we have a period of time in which we're having an unusual form of leadership coming from a bipartisan group of people in Congress in back of space. How long that will keep us going, I do not know. I do think that there's another element that will probably overwhelm Trump sooner or later, or whoever is president, and that's China. China has rapidly become the second major space power in the world, and they are now beginning to build a space station to rival ours. And they have a president for life who's an engineer. And I think they're very serious about space. So competition, conflict can make us pull our act together with or without Trump. I think.
I'd like to comment also on, in my mind, collaboration is a way for people to work equally. I think part of it, you'll hear it from the papers discussed in the next session, it is how contention can make for better collaboration because it's sometimes a subordinate group who is being coordinated by the top down, need to be sometimes use coercion to make the relationship more symmetric and better collaboration, in at least in the terms many of us speak.
John?
So that's a really interesting kind of interdisciplinary emerging idea here, listening to Robert talk and listening to you, Catherine. And a little bit, because you're doing public administration and political science, is that right, Robert? Or, no.
The political scientists may not recognize.
I'm not talking to I'm not talking to Robert, are you doing political science and public administration?
Just political science.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that helps me understand even a little bit better. It seems that, we often think about power, but our disciplines sometimes create more or less space for us to talk about it. And it feels like political science definitely, I think public administration thinks about power, but there's less space articulated in the scholarship to talk about it or to render it explicit, whereas I think political science has more space. And so this sort of comes to an interesting, there's political realism as a set of kind of batteries in our head to get us to think about stuff. So when I think about, at the granular level, Catherine, about the kinds of, qualities or habits that are necessary to get collaborative processes to move them forward, these guys are talking about giving up power, patience, respect, and these kinds of things that are conceptualized here as things that I can do as opposed to things that I'm pressured to do.
Right.
And so part of the analytical kind of challenge here, we're sort of turning to Robert for some tools, is to think about what are the forces and incentives that would lead someone to actually give up power. Because one of the big problems with the phrase giving up power is that you say it but you don't do it. We actually say I'm giving up power but we don't. And so if the process is going to be genuinely collaborative, as it were, we need more than having them say that. We have to actually figure out what are the incentives to actually do it. So I'm wondering if you want to comment.
Yeah, and I think every collaboration is different. Part of the challenge with the book is we all envision these things differently. So some of the collaborations people are writing about, again, in the context of our chapter, were really a lot of interagency collaborations where people are coming in with a problem where they need creative solutions and there's not one organization in charge. So this is a shared problem, a shared need, and therefore there isn't that sort of single administrative leader. And in that context, the notion of giving up power, I think, makes sense because if I'm going to claim all the power from my organization or dominate on behalf, because I may be a higher something than you are, I don't get my need met. So the incentive, I think, in that case is the interdependence, the need for some sort of solution, and I don't know, maybe some accountability from the top, who knows, that always helps. So I think the giving up power is specific to that context.
In the case of the space station, there was tremendous resistance on the part of the organization, NASA, to the Russian collaboration. The Russian collaboration was done at the very top with Clinton and his people and the NASA administrator. But the agency was, to some extent, still had a Cold War mentality, and also saw giving up, the collaboration would give up power, control over the technology that nurtured them. And so there was enormous resistance, bureaucratic resistance to the alliance with the Russians. There is considerable resistance at NASA to the whole idea of privatization because it means giving up power, giving up control. It's forced from the top. So you get tremendous bureaucratic political forces in combat. Giving up power is not easy.
That's right.
And sometimes it has to be forced from the top. And it certainly has been in the case of NASA and will be with this privatization movement.
Right. But agreed, interesting thing to spend
It's a
more time on.
good thing to study. I mean, it's important.
Since this is the first panel and it's setting the stage for the discussion of the book and collaboration and so on, when we started out this project a long time ago, there was
It's like far away.
trying to conceptualize a new vehicle for talking about these kinds of things. We had a sketch artist who was going to give us a contemporaneous rendering of the discussion and so on. I just want to observe and see if you can comment. I just want to observe and see if you can comment on the following observation. When I look at the table of contents of the book just now, I realize that in a book about collaboration, that fewer than half of the original articles come out of a collaborative enterprise. That puzzled me.
What do you mean?
What do you mean?
What I mean is that 42% of the articles are written by more than one person, and 50 whatever are written by teams of people. So if we're modeling, best practices in collaboration, the books don't scowl at me, Lou. It's just a question.
That's because she was a single
Collaborated
author.
with others. Okay, we get it. The book is about conflict as well, and I don't want to forget. But I want to, as a shopkeeper's son, remind you to pick up a flyer for the book, the book will be out in paperback within a year. But meanwhile, we just discovered yesterday this book is open sourced.
We don't know if it was supposed to be.
If you go to the Rutledge website, you can discover that you can read the book and all the chapters. Debbie discovered that yesterday. I confirmed it yesterday. And
You don't have to
take
buy
a look. There is a discount coupon there if you want to get a hardcover book. You can do that.
It's very pretty, but my nuns take vows of poverty, so this is very good.
Perfect.
There is an ebook version, which is a compromise.
So with that, we have time for a very short break.